Welcome to another episode of Philosophy and Critical Thinking. This video is the second video about the reading assignment, God and Religion. And in this video, we're going to talk about the argument from religious experience. We're going to talk about Pascal's wager. And we're going to talk about the problem of evil, or the argument from evil. Let's start with the argument from religious experience. So this argument begins from the premise that religious experiences occur in which God seems to be sensed. We seem to be in contact with God. Second premise of this argument is that the best explanation for these experiences is that God is indeed sensed. Namely, God caused the experience. Therefore, God probably exists. So this is a widely endorsed argument in many people's minds, whether they've actually heard of it under the name the argument from religious experience or not. This is the basis that many people have for either forming a belief in God or sustaining a belief in God. Philosopher J.L. Mackie has raised the following objection to this argument. So Mackie says, religious experiences are generally indistinguishable from experiences with a known psychological or physical cause. We know, for instance, that you can induce a religious experience in a subject in an experimental laboratory setting just by stimulating the appropriate regions of their brain. If you can do that, then you can know that sometimes these religious experiences have known physical causes. So in other words, Mackie's suggestion is maybe the underlying cause of these experiences is not God, but rather something natural or something physical or psychological. All right, a good example of a kind of religious experience might be some kind of example of a near-death experience where someone almost dies and then they report what it was like when they almost died. Maybe it was a very kind of rich and vivid experience where they seemed to be moving toward a kind of heavenly place or light. They seemed to hear sounds or voices or to see loved ones that have gone before. But then they didn't actually die, and so they lived to tell their story. That would be the kind of example that we have in mind when we're talking about a religious experience. All right, so Mackie's criticism would be, well, maybe there's a kind of physical or psychological explanation for what's going on here, and these near-death experiences aren't actually instances where people are literally in contact with dead spirits or with supernatural beings like a god. All right, so I'll leave it to all of you to consider this argument and the relevant objection in whatever way you see to be most rational. All right, what about Pascal's wager? So Blaise Pascal was a 17th century mathematician and philosopher, and he offered what he called a pragmatic justification for believing in God. A pragmatic justification is a kind of justification that appeals to what are called the practical reasons that we have for believing in God, rather than any kind of evidence that God actually exists. So the reading talks about a view called evidentialism, and evidentialism is the view that you should only believe something if you have sufficient evidence to believe it to be true. Pascal is rejecting evidentialism here and suggesting that we should believe in God because believing is advantageous. It is our best bet. All right, so here's what Pascal has in mind. He thinks that you can come up with a kind of decision matrix for believing in God, where the matrix would involve something like this. Either you believe in God or you don't believe in God. And then either God exists or God does not exist. So there are four possibilities here. You believe in God and God exists. You believe in God and God does not exist. You don't believe in God and God exists. You don't believe in God and God does not exist. Those are the four possible combinations. Now, Pascal argues that if you believe in God and God exists, you get an eternal reward in heaven. you get eternal happiness with God. If you believe in God and God doesn't exist, well, then nothing happens. Maybe you spent some time reading scripture or praying or something like that, time that you could have spent, I don't know, playing basketball or going bowling or doing whatever it is that you like to do. But you're not missing out on much. If you don't believe in God, though, and God exists, then you're going to be eternally damned in hell. If you don't believe in God and God does not exist, then nothing happens. So if you look at the possibilities attached to God not existing, where you believe in God or you don't believe in God, the possibilities are nothing really happens, right, if God doesn't exist. But if God does exist, then it really matters that you get things right, Pascal says. Because if God exists and you believe in God, you get eternal happiness. Whereas if God exists but you don't believe in God, it's really bad for you. Right? So any reasonable person can see that the most rational thing to do, given these four options, is to believe in God. Right? Because the expected value of believing in God is better than the expected value of not believing in God. All right, some criticisms that have been raised against Pascal's wager. First, how do we really know that what Pascal says are the relevant consequences of believing or not believing in God are the actual consequences? Right? So how do we know that God is going to punish us by sending us to an eternal hellfire if we don't believe in God? Isn't Pascal presupposing some doctrine of Christianity that, he's given us no reason to accept? How can we know that God will admit us into heaven if we believe in God for self-serving reasons? So according to Pascal's wager, the reason to believe in God is that it's going to be good for us. So maybe God does not reward people who believe for only self-serving reasons. Those are just a few criticisms to consider when thinking about Pascal's wager. Nevertheless, an interesting argument. All right, the last argument we're going to talk about in this video is what's called the problem of evil, or sometimes called the argument from evil. And this is an argument for atheism. It's the only argument for atheism that this reading discusses. So the problem of evil is the philosophical problem of reconciling the following two claims. First, an all-knowing, all-powerful, all-good God exists. Second, evil exists. So how do we reconcile the existence of evil with the existence of an all-good, all-knowing, all-powerful God? There are two different versions of this problem. One's called the logical problem of evil, and the other is called the evidential problem of evil. So the logical problem of evil holds that it's a logical contradiction for there to be an all-good, all-knowing, all-powerful God alongside evil. We're going to think about what's known as the evidential argument from evil, and we're going to talk about the version due to philosopher William Rowe. All right, so here is William Rowe's evidential argument from evil. Rowe says that there exist instances of intense suffering which an all-good, all-knowing, all-powerful God could have prevented without losing some greater good or permitting some evil that's equally bad or worse to these instances of intense suffering. Then Rowe says an all-good, all-knowing, all-powerful God would prevent the occurrence of any intense suffering it could, unless it couldn't prevent that suffering without losing some greater good or permitting some evil equally bad or worse. In other words, an all-good, all-knowing, all-powerful God would not allow for unnecessary suffering. That is, suffering that does not lead to some greater good, or suffering that isn't necessary for the sake of preventing some other evil that's equally bad or worse. So Rowe concludes that there probably is no all-good, all-knowing, all-powerful God. Right? So he imagines the example of a baby deer dying in a forest fire, a slow, painful death by burning. All right? And Rowe asks us, what could possibly be the greater good that comes out of this instance of suffering for the baby deer? Or if God did prevent the baby deer from suffering in this way, what is the equally bad or worse evil that would thereby be brought into existence? Right? And Rowe thinks it's just implausible to suppose that preventing the suffering of the deer in this case would result in some equally bad or worse suffering. He also rejects the idea that there's some greater good that is got out of this instance of animal suffering. All right, so generally speaking, there are two responses on behalf of theists to the problem of evil. The first is called the free will defense, and the second is called the soul-making defense. We're going to think about each one of them. The free will defense says that the reason why God admits evil and suffering in our world is that evil and suffering are the necessary byproduct of human free will. So a universe where humans have free will is better than a universe where they don't have free will, right? Even if they exercise their freedom to sometimes do bad things. All right, that's the free will defense. Now, does the free will defense work against the problem of evil? All right, so one criticism of the free will defense is this: why couldn't God have made us with free will, and yet he also made us find doing good things irresistible? So that, we would have the opportunity to do bad things. It's just that we'd find evil so detestable, we would never want to do bad things. So imagine this kind of example here. Suppose that you've been out in the desert, the hot desert, all day. It's been 100 degrees out, and you're so thirsty, and then someone presents you with a glass of ice cold water. If you have free will, you could reject the water, but you're going to find it so irresistible given how thirsty you are. Right? So the mere fact that you find it irresistible seems to be no barrier to your freely choosing to accept the drink or not. Similarly, if God had made us find good things irresistible, that wouldn't necessarily be an obstacle to our free will. So why would granting humans free will necessarily involve humans sometimes doing bad things? All right. Another response to the free will defense is that there's a difference between what's called moral evil and natural evil. So moral evil is human-caused evil or suffering, whereas natural evil is evil or suffering that's not the result of human free choice. Seems that the free will defense can only account for the existence of moral evil, and it can't explain natural evil. So it can't explain why there would be instances of suffering that result from natural disasters or disease. For example, why do children sometimes die of cancer? Well, the free will defense doesn't seem to offer any kind of explanation for that, because a child having cancer isn't the result of human free choice. A natural disaster like a hurricane or a flood that potentially kills thousands of people is not the result of human free choice. Right? So what is a plausible explanation for why an all-good, all-knowing, all-powerful God would allow for the existence of natural evil? Or how is it justified for the baby deer to die in the forest fire? Another response to the argument from evil is what is called the soul-making defense. So John Hick, a philosopher, has argued that evil is necessary to provide humans with a world where moral and spiritual progress is possible. Personal growth, or soul-making, can only take place in a world where humans can make free choices and in a world where there is pain and sometimes anguish. If everything were just rosy around us, we wouldn't live in a world where it was possible to grow spiritually, because nothing would be difficult, nothing would be tough. And it's in the face of adversity and difficulty that we can grow as individuals. Right, so that's the soul-making defense. You might wonder, does the soul-making defense succeed in explaining all instances of suffering or evil in our world? So, for example, take a small child that dies of a terminal illness. How does their dying of that terminal illness help their own soul to grow? Right, so these are difficult cases, but we need some kind of explanation for how, in these cases, soul-making is possible in order for this soul-making defense to actually work.